United States is under attack, sir.
When A House of Dynamite premiered on Netflix, it immediately sparked a storm of debate and speculation. Directed by Academy Award winner Kathryn Bigelow and written by Noah Oppenheim, the film's tightly wound 18-minute countdown and morally complex decision-making left audiences breathless and divided. The ending's refusal to show whether the missile detonated in Chicago or whether the president responded with nuclear retaliation created a vacuum filled by fan theories and philosophical discussions. But what if the unthinkable happened? What if the missile actually hit? Exploring that possibility not only reshapes how we interpret the film's final act, but also exposes its deeper layers about power, consequence, and the illusion of control. The real threat hidden behind the countdown. Throughout A House of Dynamite, time is the true antagonist. The film doesn't rely on a physical villain in the traditional sense. Instead, it pits humanity against the merciless ticking of the clock. The 18 minutes between launch and impact symbolize the razor-thin edge on which civilization balances. If the missile did hit Chicago, that ticking clock wasn't a countdown to suspense, it was a countdown to confirmation. Everything we saw, from the president's frantic calls to the advisor's moral paralysis to the crumbling communication lines, would transform from a near-disaster scenario into a full-blown apocalypse of responsibility. In Oppenheim's version, the ambiguity forces viewers to imagine that outcome. But imagining isn't the same as seeing. What the audience never sees, the potential detonation, is precisely what defines the film's restraint. Yet if we allow ourselves to fill in that blank, the aftermath becomes a mirror reflecting the film's moral question. What happens when the unthinkable finally becomes real? Chicago as a symbol, not just a target. The choice of Chicago as the potential strike location is not accidental. In American cinema, Chicago is often portrayed as the beating heart of the nation, a crossroads of culture, economy, and identity. Destroying Chicago isn't merely a regional tragedy. It's an attack on the idea of America itself. If the missile hit, it wouldn't just annihilate millions of lives. It would obliterate the symbolic sense of control the U.S. has always claimed in matters of defense and deterrence. In this alternate ending, Bigelow's directorial style would likely shift from the procedural realism of Zero Dark 30 to the haunting, fragmented imagery reminiscent of The Hurt Locker, Silent Ash, unrecognizable landscapes, and the hollow aftermath of decision-making. A hit on Chicago would instantly collapse the illusion of deterrence that drives global politics. The president's power to decide would be rendered meaningless, because once the explosion occurs, there are no choices left to make, only consequences to endure. Power, responsibility, and the human error factor. Noah Oppenheim said that A House of Dynamite is ultimately about whether one person should have the power to decide the fate of all mankind.
Your orders, Mr. President.
My orders.
This is where the missile hits theory becomes terrifyingly relevant. If the missile truly detonated, then the entire system of checks and balances, meant to prevent unilateral rash actions, would be proven futile. The movie makes clear that every chain of command, every protocol, every layer of technology is vulnerable to human error. The president, played by Idris Elba, is cornered between duty and conscience, between saving face politically and saving lives ethically. The moment the missile launches, his humanity is reduced to an algorithm of cost-benefit calculations. If Chicago was indeed destroyed, it would expose a brutal truth, that deterrence is a lie sustained by hope, not logic. Humanity's safety relies not on strength, but on luck, and the assumption that no one will actually press the button. The missile hitting Chicago breaks that illusion, revealing that civilization's stability is as fragile as one human heartbeat. The chain reaction, domestic and global fallout, a direct nuclear strike on Chicago would unleash consequences far beyond physical destruction. The social, political, and psychological chain reaction would be almost biblical in scale. In this hidden ending, Oppenheim's dialogue and Bigelow's direction would likely emphasize the collapse of communication and trust, both between nations and within the American psyche. Domestically, the loss of a major city would shatter faith in leadership. The leader of the free world would instantly become the commander of chaos. Martial law would likely be declared. Panic, misinformation, and revenge politics would spiral out of control. The haunting imagery of phones ringing unanswered and screens flickering static in the command bunker would symbolize a government trying to talk to a world that no longer listens. Globally, allies would question the stability of American deterrence, while adversaries might seize the moment to escalate their own strategic postures. Nuclear treaties would crumble overnight. The illusion of mutual safety, the very concept of MAD, mutually assured destruction, would no longer act as a deterrent but as a prophecy. The unanswered question, retaliation or restraint. The second question Oppenheim leaves unanswered. Whether the president ordered a retaliatory strike is perhaps even more consequential than the detonation itself. If the missile hit Chicago, would the U.S. have responded with equal force? In the theoretical alternate cut, the president's decision not to retaliate could serve as the film's tragic moral victory. He would stand in the ruins of Chicago and choose not to doom the world to a cycle of vengeance. On the other hand, a retaliatory strike would confirm the worst fears of the film, that humanity is incapable of breaking the chain of destruction once it begins. Either way, the ending becomes a meditation on control. Even with the power to destroy, the president is powerless to reverse time. The world becomes a reflection of his internal conflict, silence, ash, and guilt echoing across empty streets that once thrived with life. The psychological impact, the silence after the explosion. Bigelow's films are often about the personal cost of global-scale trauma. In The Hurt Locker, war was experienced through the soldier's addiction to danger. In Zero Dark 30, justice blurred into obsession. A House of Dynamite would continue this pattern. If the missile hit, the film's final act would descend into a quiet, psychological horror. The surviving characters would become ghosts in a living world. Rebecca Ferguson's character, the intelligence officer, might grapple with the guilt of misinterpreting data. Caitlin Dever's role as the civilian caught in the chaos would shift from fear to numbness. Gabriel Basso's military liaison, whose faith in the system defines his identity, would be left hollow. The silence after the explosion, the absence of music, dialogue, or movement would communicate what words cannot, that the end of the world doesn't come with fire and screams, but with unbearable quiet. A mirror to the real world. The brilliance of A House of Dynamite is that it's not really about missiles or explosions. It's about the systems we've built to convince ourselves that we're safe. Oppenheim's choice to leave the ending open wasn't cowardice, it was an artistic dare. He forces viewers to confront how easily they fill the silence with their own fears. If the missile hit, that outcome doesn't just exist in fiction. It's a reflection of the latent terror we all live with. The film's events unfold in real time, but its themes unfold in perpetuity. Nuclear weapons, misinformation, and political ego are not relics of the Cold War. They're everyday realities lurking beneath the headlines. By leaving the question unanswered, Oppenheim made the movie timeless. But by imagining that the missile actually hit, we expose how fragile that timelessness really is. The moment it happens, A House of Dynamite stops being speculative fiction and becomes prophetic. The unseen ending, the president's final moment. Let's imagine, for a moment, what the hidden ending would look like if Bigelow had chosen to show it. The countdown reaches 0. Silence. Then, a blinding flash reflected on the president's face. The sound fades before the explosion, leaving only the hum of air conditioning and the slow collapse of his composure. He doesn't issue a command. He doesn't scream. He simply stares at the screen as it cuts to static. That would be the real ending, not an explosion, but a realization. The president becomes both victim and witness, powerless and guilty all at once. In that version, A House of Dynamite transforms from a thriller into a tragedy. It's no longer about the fear of destruction. It's about the aftermath of decision-making, the unbearable weight of survival when you've failed to prevent the end. The message buried in the ashes. If the missile hit Chicago, the final takeaway wouldn't be nihilism. It would be responsibility. The call to attention that Oppenheim mentioned becomes literal. Humanity's wake-up call. The film's true question, should one person have the power to decide the fate of all mankind, becomes rhetorical after the explosion. The answer is clear, no. And yet, in the real world, that system remains unchanged. Every day, the same decisions are entrusted to a handful of individuals, all of them bound by flawed systems, human impulses, and ticking clocks. The horror of A House of Dynamite lies not in what it shows, but in what it suggests could happen, and perhaps already almost has. Conclusion. The explosion we never see. If A House of Dynamite had shown the missile hitting Chicago, it would have destroyed more than a city. It would have shattered the illusion of safety that sustains modern civilization. Oppenheim and Bigelow didn't need to show that scene because, in a way, it's already playing out in our collective imagination. Every time the news flashes an alert, every time we hear about escalation or retaliation, that unseen explosion echoes again. So what if the missile hit? Maybe it did, in the minds of everyone who watched the film and felt that pit in their stomach as the countdown ended. The blast we never see is the one that never stops reverberating, inside the bunker, inside the story, and inside us.